Hello and welcome everyone to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host, and with me for an interesting episode is my friend and yours, Missy. Welcome,
Hello
Missy.
again. Hi. Long time no talk.
It's been a little while.
Been a bit.
We've been
Yep.
talking about doing this episode, I feel like for a year. I feel
That's
like
that's our MO though at this point. Like we always go, hey, here's a topic, and then a year or two later we finally get around to discussing it.
well, it's because you and I like kind of research, but like sometimes the topic is actually quite overwhelming. And
Yes.
like this one is quite overwhelming to try and tackle, and to be fair to it, I think is also a consideration. This topic is nostalgia in Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I'm already like pushing buttons when I say those words out loud. It feels like it's quite sensitive.
Yes. Yes. I think everyone should come to this conversation with an open mind because nostalgia is inescapable in general. It is just something that everyone of all ages, every culture, everyone experiences it. And it obviously, I think, is a huge, huge part of our experience of Star Wars, both what we love about it and sometimes what we don't love about it. And so I think it's a really important conversation.
And I think that it has this like social media rep about it.
Mhm.
Like some people really lean into the nostalgia and love it, or like, exist kind of in this liminal space of always talking about the things that they loved in their childhood in good ways, potentially in very negative, toxic ways. And
Mhm.
then there's also like people who have had like almost allergic reaction to nostalgia.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a huge range.
It's a huge range. But in general, what Missy and I are going to try to walk you through with this episode is that nostalgia is critical to human bonding. However, it can be misused in ways that kind of trap us in the past.
Mhm.
And I'm really, really excited to explore this with you, Missy, because it is something that you and I have both struggled with in good and bad ways, in that we've been fans for a really, really long time. How I Met My Husband, one of the first topics we had, like chatted about when we were just even friends, was how much we both love Star Wars.
Yep. Same. Same. Yeah, and I remember seeing, I want to say it was Revenge of the Sith with my husband when it came out. And that would have been like really early in our
Hmm.
relationship and everything. So, yeah, I mean, it's just Star Wars is a huge part of my friendships. For
Hmm.
example, you and me, obviously. Huge part of my friendships, huge part, obviously, of my marriage. Like one of the first things we did when our kids were old enough was to immediately introduce them to Star Wars as fast as we could, right? And be like, yeah, let's
Hmm.
talk about this thing. So it's just huge. And then, like, obviously, I seek out fan communities and everything. So like, yeah, do I trade on Star Wars nostalgia? Heck yeah, absolutely I do. And do I get excited when I see things that I remember and I recognize from my childhood experience of Star Wars?
Hmm.
Absolutely. I get so excited. Some things I just lose my mind with excitement because I'm like, that's so cool. I love that. We talked about this, I think, when we did our what was our Alkalite trailer reaction.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I said that like seeing everybody whip all their lightsabers out at once got me feeling very nostalgic for the last time I can remember seeing that, which was seeing Attack of the Clones in theaters. And
Hmm.
so, it is absolutely legit. It is a real feeling. People experience it. It's a huge part of the appeal. Why this IP is such a juggernaut.
Yep.
you know,
Absolutely.
it's a real thing.
It's one of the reasons why Star Wars Celebration is like a big thing, in that you
Yeah.
kind of get to go to nostalgic summer camp
Mhm.
every
Yes,
year,
yes,
every time that it's on,
exactly.
and it's all just good vibes, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody, like my good friend Joe Brennan actually talked about this when he went to Celebration London. He's like, all of the things about Star Wars that I have criticism about are smoothed over.
Yeah. It
Like
all flies out the window because you're just so excited to be surrounded by all that energy and those other fans.
yeah. And also
Hmm.
just like being there in the moment live with people is, you just appreciate every aspect of it so much more. you know,
Yeah.
and the feelings that everybody is giving off. There's definitely something about human energy that makes this,
Absolutely.
you know, so much more real for us.
I remember seeing Phantom Menace for the first time in theaters, and there was a whole thing. You know, we had my friends and I, all girls. We had a Star Wars sleepover where we binged the original trilogy, and we had
Yeah.
Millennium Falcon voice recorders, and we did our hair like Leia, and it was the whole nine, right? And so we had so much fun. And then because we were still in high school, we couldn't go get tickets. So one of the mothers went and like stood in line for tickets for us and got us all tickets so that we could be at the first showing. And we're all there. And I remember just the screams in the theater. And like when Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan pulled their hoods down and everyone lost their minds. Like, I mean, if you
When the lightsabers ignited for the first time, when Qui-Gon went through the door, like all of these things that felt like we could never see them before, and or maybe, you know, we read about something that was similar in the EU, or like it was like brand new.
Yeah.
But it bonds you to that time.
And what's so funny about it is that ultimately, of course, many people, and to some extent myself included, were disappointed by the film. It's got a lot of flaws, you know, like there's some issues with Phantom Menace just from an execution perspective. However, the experience of seeing it in the theater with other fans, with that excitement and that energy and that memory of the last time you saw Star Wars kind of coming to life there, like that was still amazing, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And I think that's the critical thing to remember, is that ultimately, regardless of the quality of the, you know, the storytelling or whatever, these are communal memories and experiences that bond people. Like you feel bonded to everyone else who's screaming in the theater when the lightsabers ignite. It's just, it's like, yes, we are the same. We are together.
We are together.
Yes.
And it's really fascinating that like nostalgia is not something that we generally talk about in our daily lives. Like
no, not
it
really.
is like maybe a little bit with regards to like, oh, that's so nostalgic, you know, or you offhandedly say it, or but it is it is incredibly pervasive in our modern storytelling, marketing. It is, in some ways, it's starting to feel like it's incredibly overused.
Yeah, you could argue that almost every story now is dependent on nostalgia.
Yeah.
There are very few stories that are willing to step outside of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to play a clip from the show Mad Men because it encapsulates the power of this in one moment. So let me go ahead and do that.
Technology is a glittering lure. There's the rare occasion when the public can be engaged on a level beyond flash if they have a sentimental bond with the product. My first job, I was in-house at a fur company with this old pro copywriter, Greek, named Teddy. And Teddy told me the most important idea in advertising is new, creates an itch. You simply put your product in there as a kind of calamine lotion. But he also talked about a deeper bond with the product. Nostalgia. It's delicate, but potent. Teddy told me that in Greek, nostalgia literally means the pain from an old wound in your heart, far more powerful than memory alone. This device isn't a spaceship, it's a time machine. It goes backwards, forwards, takes us to a place where we ache to go again. It's not called the wheel, it's called the carousel. It lets us travel the way a child travels, round and around, and back home again, to a place we know we are loved.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think the audio is very powerful, but if you get the opportunity to go watch the clip, I do recommend it because the visuals are quite powerful too. You know, the gist of it is that whatever you've experienced since, those kind of sweet memories will always kind of take you back, and you're always going to have this emotional reaction to them. Really, really, no matter what happened afterwards. And that's so interesting.
Nostalgia itself is from two words, right? Algia in the Greek, longing, shared longing, and nostos, which is home. So it's like a version of homesickness.
Right.
But this home is subjective, could be collective, and could not even exist.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be talking about a frame that we're using for this episode, which is we both read the book, The Future of Nostalgia by Svetlana Boym, who really is looking at nostalgia from the former USSR and the member countries and locations. There was this collective idea of longing for this homeland that didn't exist. And she goes into like all of the background of how nostalgia was treated as a genuine sickness in the 1800s. In fact, some of the prescriptions to cure it was go and hang out in a hot springs for for a week and relax your body, and it'll go away.
Here, we made you some soup similar to your mom's. Have this; it'll make you feel better. Like things like that.
Yeah. And, it was on the level of like having TB and like tuberculosis. Like they treated it very seriously because it was, in some ways, if you were removed from your homelands and there was the diasporic sort of view of that, you longed for this thing that you could never have back. Right. And they didn't have the technology of the times to be able to, I don't know, give it to us.
Yeah, bring it with them in any way, right? They wouldn't have had like images from home, objects from, especially soldiers, right? They wouldn't have had objects from home. They wouldn't have had, and in many cases, they had never left home before. So, they were home their entire lives. Then they went and fought in a foreign country, and they had nothing familiar and nothing of home whatsoever. And so it literally made them sick. I mean, effectively it's a form of depression, right? But they were specifically tying it to this desperate longing for home. And what's so interesting is, in that clip, he says, it's an ache, right? It's an ache for home. Well, that's true because longing, Alja, is also, sometimes interpreted as pain, right? So it's like this painful longing. It's just this, and it, nostos, not just home, but even return home, like in an Odysseus sense, like trying to return home, but the home is not what you remember. So, so they treat it as a sickness, and it was that way actually for a really, really long time before I think it was all the way even into the early 20th century that it was still considered like an illness of sorts. So
Svetlana actually explores the former Soviet Union states from this angle, from this lens of almost the propaganda, the imageries, the statues, this idea of trying to like bring back this homeland, this home that people feel in a very real collective sense. And in some ways, she points out that it's the dream of what the homeland could have been, rather than what it actually was.
Right. Well, because especially she talks about how a lot of the people that she interviewed were fellow defectors or expats or whatever. And the clearly had a good reason to leave the USSR, right? Something was clearly not okay that they chose to leave. But then when she speaks to them, their memories are so much rosier than would make sense for people who chose to actually leave their home. And so she's saying, like they don't even remember how bad it was in reality because they miss their home and the comfort of home so desperately that they have created an image of it in their mind, which is this, again, this rosy memory of like, oh, it was so much better because of this, that, and the other thing. Yeah.
And this nostalgia could even take place in situations of being like sort of romanticizing time periods that you even never experienced. Dr. David Newman actually talks about how, sometimes people are nostalgic for like the Renaissance era or the Regency era. Like we're kind of experiencing it a little bit with Bridgerton.
Oh, 100%. Right? People are like, it's so romantic. And it was like, it was kind of awful. But
or like Jane Austen novels, right? And it's like, you could be like, I want to live that, but historic nostalgia can actually be quite dangerous because sometimes people are trying to use that as a power to sort of push this idea that to restore to a previous way of being where, racism or practices of discrimination or it's about power. It's a tool for power. And I think we can hear that in that Mad Men clip that it is very fragile. But if you can kind of almost create a version of homeland that doesn't exist and people buy into it in a very real way, it's typically what we view as propaganda, but it's actually about creating a false version of your childhood or your home or what doesn't actually exist.
Well, I think the 50s are often used in this way. I think the 50s is,
from a
portrayed
conservative
as
value perspective.
Yes, it's portrayed as this
better.
Yeah, it's portrayed as this idyllic time when everything was great, and if only we could return to that, everything would be fine. And of course, the reality is everything wasn't great. And we'll get into this further, but particularly if you were not the in group, if you were not in power, and this is one of the things about nostalgia is that nostalgia it creates communal bonds, but communal bonds for whom? It almost presupposes an in group and an out group. Because there's the shared memory of the in-group. Remember when everything was great because we were in power or we benefited from the power structure that existed at the time. Or you have the people where actually that sucks and I don't have that shared memory of that time because it was awful because my people were oppressed during that time or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting the way that nostalgic memories tend to break down along socioeconomic lines of quite frequently.
Yeah,
and
or racial lines.
or racial. Yeah.
And it's really interesting because I've been seeing a lot of on social media, people being very nostalgic for the 1990s.
Yes, I've seen a lot of that.
A lot of that. And it's it wasn't good for everybody.
It wasn't. That's a thing. And that's a thing. It was.
It might have been good for your group.
Right.
But trust me, it wasn't good for everybody. And
exactly.
Svetlana actually talks about how this is almost built from a conspiracy theory perspective in that they call it a collective conspiracy.
Yeah.
And it is absolutely used similar to the mechanisms of conspiracy to create a we for whatever reason, feel insecure in the modern world and find a scapegoat for our misfortunes, somebody different from us whom we don't like. We project the dislike on them and begin to believe that they dislike us and wish to persecute us. They conspire against our homecoming, bringing back our restorative fake homeland.
Right.
And then we conspire collectively against them to restore our imagined community. And we absolutely see it play out in Star Wars fans.
100%. Well, okay. I mean, I'm going to go back to what was the common thing everyone said back when the prequels came out? The phrase, and I'm sorry, it's crude, but this is what people said was George Lucas raped my childhood. And what a horrific thing to say. But this is what people said, and they meant it because they were so desperately attached to the memory they had of Star Wars, presumably from when they were children, that having it presented in any way other than mirroring that exact memory that they had was so offensive to them that it was this person is responsible for separating me from my homeland. That was how they viewed it.
It was a forced separation away from this childhood imagined safe, secure home that they had. And so what we see play out in especially the Star Wars fandom, but also how Svetlana talks about how people sort of react to nostalgia is we see kind of two different avenues. We see restorative nostalgia, and this is the idea that leads us to attempt to recreate the past home in our modern era. And she talks about it quite a bit with regards to the USSR and how, there's statues, there's people trying to restore the past. We see it a lot in conservative politics.
Yep.
it's used when they almost try to bring back the things that they think worked in the past to recreate the past now.
Right. It's yeah, or it's like something venerating something that either, was not great or was actually not a big deal at the time. So like, but it's useful for their purposes. So this is like in the US, this was like the building of Confederate statues. Like that happened
I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
Like the 1920s. So we're talking, what is that? That's like 60 years after the Civil War.
Nobody brought it up until then, but then suddenly.
But it became useful to be like, oh, remember this glorious past. And so that's when they built all these. And so that's where you get into this idea of like, it's myth making. It is, we're creating this shared memory for the group so that we can use that to get them to have antipathy towards the people they feel have robbed them of that.
And it's this delusional homeland that never existed. It creates this collective conspiracy that if only we could get back to the values of the past, we could recreate this homeland and the past could be restored. It is an absolute favorite tool of fascism.
100%. Absolutely.
And the worst part is that it can work because there's been many studies on how memory can be just absolutely influenced by, don't you remember when Luke Skywalker was a badass?
Right, exactly.
Right? Bugs Bunny in Disneyland, I'll link to that, story in the liner notes. Our memories can be falsified, and our feeling of this delusional homeland can be absolutely created, especially if we have a strong but like a very formative connection, emotional connection to the subject matter.
Right. Absolutely. And it's so interesting because the very things that give Star Wars its power and the things that when we talk about it, point to as its strengths and what is so wonderful about it, those are the exact things which create this emotional attachment that then over time can potentially become manipulated and used in order to turn people against one another. And that's where you get. And we're going to go into how nostalgia actually appears in the text of Star Wars, as well as obviously in the fan reaction to it. But referencing specifically the fan reaction, that's where you get people gatekeeping and saying that you're not a real fan if you like this or don't like this or whatever. Like that's where you get that kind of stuff, is because they're creating in-groups and out-groups based on their shared vision of Star Wars.
And so as we go through this, I think it's really important to take a moment for yourself after you listen to this episode and really think about what is your Star Wars homeland. Because I'm going to tell you, it's going to be entirely different than somebody else's.
Yeah.
Or you've leaned into the nostalgia of somebody else and have taken on their homeland.
Right. Exactly.
We see that a lot with YouTubers. We see that a lot with, remember when a character like Rose didn't exist?
Right. Right. Yeah.
She's the reason your problems are happening. Exactly what we talked about when we talked to this collective conspiracy.
Right.
She's the reason why you don't have Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Leia off on their adventures.
Right. Exactly. Well, because Disney went woke, and so therefore, what you knew as Star Wars has been taken from you and everything. Like that's the story you get a lot, and it's messed up because
it's convoluted. Like the logic behind it is
there's no logic.
It's all emotional pleas to the person's inner child in so many ways. It's like, you could have this back. Can you?
Yeah. No. And that's the thing about nostalgia ultimately, is that longing to return home, you really can't. And this is the thing, is that, so Svetlana talks about how, when these people that she interviewed would actually finally return, they would find that the home they remembered was not there, either because it had never been there or because it had simply changed so much. Because and that's another thing I want to get into a little bit later when we really start talking about how this manifests in Star Wars, is that it is impossible to return to your nostalgic home. It's not possible because time is linear and things change and things age. Things age, they decay. Time is not static. And so whatever that nostalgic memory is can only ever be that. You can't recreate it, and attempts to do so can be very destructive, or again, can trap you in the past where you can't ever move forward.
And that's the other part of nostalgia where people get stuck in it. It's reflective nostalgia. And it's almost like an unrequited love sickness. Like you can never get past it. It's this like living in longing, or like you've set up your house in the ruins of the dream of a different time.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing they do is they like sometimes to try to like cure nostalgia, they would actually build or use nostalgia. They would build fake ruins.
Yeah.
Like they're not even real ruins. They're literally fake. But they would build ruins just to be like, see, this past actually existed when it didn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or like how, again, the Nazis tried to trace their Aryan lineage back to Atlantis. It was like we're magical special people that didn't ever exist. It was like trying to create this like reflective past that tied directly to the past. We see this a lot with the like right wing classical restorative accounts on social media.
Where classicism
like,
accounts.
Classicism. Like they're trying to hold up this ideal of what Greek and Roman history from a mythological perspective was. But you and I have talked a lot about how both how queer it was and how it wasn't exactly what they thought it was. Like the idea that like things weren't as queer as they thought it was. And so when I watch a historical documentary about Alexander the Great, and the first thing was the greatest love of his life was his like boyfriend. Yes.
Yeah, that was true. Well, and it's what's so funny about that perspective, and this is why such a good example of nostalgia is even the imagery they use of like these beautiful marble statues isn't actually historically accurate because most of those statues were painted. They were white. The only reason they're white is because it's been the passage of time. Things have changed. It is not what it once was. And we can't go back to that because that's not even real. So it's like, it's so amazing the way that people will just attach themselves. And again, it's human. It's normal. We all do it. But it's important to be aware of it because attaching yourself to a past that doesn't even exist and never existed and can't possibly be resurrected anyway is just, again, a recipe for destruction and a failure to progress and to grow.
Yep. And also it ends up like sort of trapping you in this, like, if you get stuck in that us versus them so quickly, like talking about, Katie's amazing Rewriting Ripley article and how the language that is used in that is the language of nostalgia. I feel like this episode and what she has produced are really good companions.
Yeah.
So I just, again, I'll link to that because that's always a good thing to reread with this lens in mind. I do want to just quickly call out that like the good things about nostalgia, like we said, was like those community bonding experiences. It promotes this sense of self in that you can build a sense of self, and as long as it's based in a close version of reality, it's actually quite good for people to understand where they come from and to recognize that and call back to it. My family is quite good at that. We talk about our family history in very realistic terms. But it's good to be like, oh yeah, my people come from, this person that emigrated from Ireland like many years ago, and they were farmers and they also did these other things, and then kind of like just telling the history of the family, because it gives you a sense of where you exist in that long line of people as well. It
It's
also
so
shows
important.
growth.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I used to be a child. I did all
Yeah.
of these things that maybe weren't the greatest, but now I've grown and I'm
Mhm.
better because of it.
Yeah.
And also it can make you feel good to temporarily live in the past when things were simpler. And it has been shown to at least temporarily relieve depression and sadness.
Yeah, exactly. Like reliving happy memories is a really important part of having a healthy psyche. Like it just is, and like if you're dealing with depression, like, having things and whatever that reminds you of home and comfort and
Mhm.
safety, these are really, really important. So, like there's absolutely no reason to say that that happy memories, even when they're sometimes not totally realistic, there's nothing wrong with it. It really isn't. And I want to really go back briefly to your point about, the communal bonds and everything. It is so important to preserving heritage,
Mhm.
especially within a diaspora,
Mhm.
because so I've been doing a lot of reading recently about the Somali diaspora in Minnesota in the US. It's huge. It's like one of the largest diasporas in North America, if not the largest diaspora. And so for Somali anyway. It's really remarkable the way that the heritage has been so well preserved in spite of being in a place that is truly nothing like the homeland that was left behind. And, I'm sure that there are memories, shared memories, or maybe storytelling happening in the community that might not perfectly reflect historical reality. But it's not being used to exclude, and it's not being used to harm. And it's or at least I guess I can't speak to that since I'm not part of the group. But my understanding from what I have read is that generally it is mostly just looking to preserve that heritage and maintain community. And this is, I think it can be a very good thing. So that's something I really want to get into here is it can always be used for good or ill. And I think that when we talk about it within Star Wars,
it's just a tool. It's a storytelling
it's a tool. It's a storytelling tool. Like we talk all the time about how, Star Wars is mythology. It's a modern myth. And so nostalgia it's inseparable from nostalgia in that way. It's part of it. George Lucas brought his own nostalgia to the story. Why did he tell a spaghetti Western in space? Because he loved spaghetti Westerns as a child.
Absolutely.
Like
the Searchers is so
absolutely.
prevalent in Star Wars. Flash Gordon,
Yes.
Metropolis, Casablanca, like these stories that inspired George are part of it, and homage is about paying respect to your liege lord or the lord. That's literally the meaning. Homage means to respect your liege lord. You pay homage to them. And in that way, George is like paying respect to his nostalgia.
Yes.
By recreating it in his own lens and in his own idea. Same with the mythology that he ties into and uses the motifs from. He's paying respect to the time that came before. And in that way, I think it's a healthy use of a way to take that feelings of homeland and give it a new life. Give it a new life in this new universe that he's telling stories in.
Yeah, and there was a moral dimension to what he was doing. He felt that it was important to tell this story at the time that he did. Like and the same was true later when he did the prequels. He felt like he had an important message to convey. And yes, it traded on nostalgia in order to get people emotionally invested so that they would hear the message.
And in so many ways, he used analog versions because there was in that time there was versions of technology that looked less analog, but he relied on analog technology looks and the set builders, the concept artists, they all wanted to give this feel of older in respect to Star Wars to feel like it was even in modern eyes an older story.
Right. Well, even the way that he sets it, he doesn't set it in the future the way you would expect for a space story. He says a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It is inherently nostalgic, like by definition. That is what it is. And it's, he talks about it being based on fairy tales, obviously, and mythology and everything. And he talks about how it's based on stories that we, and he means, again, communally, the society, would tell each other growing up. And these were stories that children would grow up with. And he felt that was important to their moral formation and that it was lacking. And so he felt like this movie could help provide that. And so he made it with every intent that it would be nostalgia. That was the point.
And in some ways, because it felt nostalgic in its creation, it's gonna be latched onto in a place of safety, right?
Yes.
And nostalgia becomes a defense mechanism against accelerated rhythms of change. And can you describe a time in humanity that has dealt with so much change in such short periods of time? It's never ending with our technology, with our access to information, with our access to other people. Marshall McLuhan talks about how he's like, oh, technology is going to lead us to this global village. We're literally in each other's backyards. We're next to each other. We can see people's emotions from across the world. And so we're going to lead and lean more into those nostalgic feelings when things were simpler. And so it's easier to get stuck in this.
Yeah. Well,
which is hard.
Yeah. So one thing I definitely want to do is start to go into how nostalgia appears textually in Star Wars.
Ooh.
Like the actual characters experiencing nostalgia. I think that's really important to talk about before we kind of get into fan reactions.
Where does it start? I think it starts with Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I agree, because he tells Luke about the Jedi Knights of the Old Republic or whatever. And
the Clone Wars and your father being, a Jedi Knight like myself.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's where it starts, because he imparts to Luke this nostalgic vision of the Jedi Order and the Republic and how much better everything was. And it was the glory days. And that is what is communicated to Luke and therefore the audience in that moment.
Yep. Oh, wasn't the High Republic amazing?
Yeah, exactly.
Wasn't the Old Republic amazing? Wasn't, having 1,000 Jedi Knights across the galaxy in an age of peace amazing?
Yep. Exactly. And what I love so much about that is that was our understanding of Star Wars for so long. And then George came in with the prequels and was like, actually,
yeah,
it's like that rosy time wasn't so rosy.
And this is an important thing for us to talk about because, when we get into the Acolyte, do people carry with them the sense of the nostalgia associated with the High Republic or the Old Republic that Obi-Wan had because of how it was presented in the original trilogy? And when we get the Acolyte, and even before the fall of the Republic, we have a sense that nothing is right.
Yeah, something is wrong. Yeah. Something is wrong. And it's and what Star Wars does so well that I love is that it really gets at, the moral rot that exists under the rosy facade, right? The glittering facade. Sure. And that's what's so interesting is that it really, at the same time that it trades on nostalgia, it also, peels back the mask and reveals that it's not real. That shared memory that we have it's not reality. It's not the way things really were. It's not what really happened. And I think that's really important.
And Obi-Wan himself was fairly nostalgic about the past. And, even now we have examples of this idea of what is homeland for Star Wars fans. And I'm really excited to get into that aspect of it. But let's continue on the conversation about where nostalgia ends up happening. I think the next sort of version of nostalgia in sort of text happens with Yoda again.
Agreed. I agree.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, because he's also referring to the way things used to be, and what an ideal Jedi Knight is. And that's another interesting thing, is that Yoda holds on to this ideal of a Jedi Knight, which is a good thing. But as far as we can tell, there weren't any actual Jedi Knights that met that ideal.
No. Even him, he was so fallible, like
exactly
in the end, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so that definitely shows up, which is very interesting. And then obviously the other amazing moment of undermining the nostalgia is the revelation that Darth Vader is Luke's father, because this picture that he had in his mind of his father is completely destroyed by reality.
And I can imagine how devastating that would have been to actually view live, like in the theater, because you've had this view of the world as like these characters. You're like, Luke, he's fighting the bad guy, but the bad guy is actually a part of him now.
Yes.
And you have to settle that in your minds. And that's really the key. It's so cool how Star Wars also presents these problems and solves them for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's why, Luke's loss of his hand is so important at that moment, because it's this dismemberment. It is this separation from that belief and that false memory that he has, and the realization that it's not real and it's not true. And so he's separated from his hand, but he's separated from his home, because his home was the belief that his father was a good man.
Yeah.
And now he's lost that home.
Exactly. And he has to go through this whole journey of like struggling with his own darkness. And Robert Bly talks about eating the shadow, right? This Jungian concepts. And that's the key, is like you have to kind of understand the darkness of the past at the same time as the like rosy lens that you had, and come to some sort of resolution of what the truth was, to sort of get yourself out of the nostalgic trap.
Right. Well, I think it's two potential solutions to nostalgia. One, of course, is the revelation that, that it's not real, or rather that you can't return to it, I think. So either one of those definitely is one. But then the other is just the choice to turn from the focus on the past and turn toward the future, and turn toward what's next, and what you can build and what you can make, and how you can change things for the better. And I think that is what I think is extraordinary about Luke's story. And this is where I think that Star Wars, it kind of, at least in that regard, peaked there, and they've struggled to get back there, because what Luke does is, he deals with this destruction of his homeland, both literally and figuratively. I mean, keep in mind, Tatooine, like his, like there was the smoking corpses of his aunt and uncle. It was awful.
He can never go home again.
He can never go home. So that happens to him. And then the father, and then, the loss of the mentors. He loses Obi-Wan and all this other stuff, and his
Yoda.
Yeah, his failure, the fact that, like even his friends almost in a way don't need him, really. Like, he's on his own. And so what's so interesting about Luke Skywalker's story is that he is the one that breaks the cycle. He breaks away from the expectations of his mentors and his parents and everything that everyone tells him that he has to do. You have to kill your father, Luke, all this other stuff. And the expectations, and even Palpatine saying, oh, you're definitely going to fall to the dark side. No, he breaks away from all of that.
He's like, this carousel is stopping. Excuse me.
Yes. And he makes his own choices. He changes things. He breaks the patterns, and he moves the galaxy into the new. And so he doesn't, like, there's a big deal about, the restoration of the Republic. That's not really the point. It's not about restoring what was old. It's about creating something new. And that's what happens at the end of Return of the Jedi, is Luke said no to all of those false memories and the idea that things were better in the past, and we just got to get back to that. And he said, I'm doing something new. Yep. And I wish Star Wars, I love him so much for that. And I wish Star Wars could get back there.
Yeah. It's struggled ever since.
It has. It's come close, but it hasn't, in my opinion, it hasn't quite gotten back to that. So like there's my nostalgia. I'm very nostalgic for the end of Return of the Jedi. Very
Same.
much so. Yeah. And nothing has quite recreated that feeling for me yet. So
same. And then, we ended up getting news stories in the EU and stories of the past about what the High Republic or the Republic was like before, things that happened during the Clone Wars, like all sort of laid out in different novelizations. We got the EU sort of telling stories in the future with, of course, the Thrawn novelizations, the original ones, Heir to the Empire, kind of saying, oh, what if we could restore Palpatine?
Yeah.
like a restorative in the most evil fascist sense, right? Using that restorative story to say, let's literally bring a guy back from the dead.
Yep.
And it has that very zombie-like quality when enacted in Star Wars, which in some ways is actually very realistic when you actually are successful at restoring something. It feels zombie-like sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to the whole problem with nostalgia sometimes is that because it's a longing for a past which cannot actually be created. And again, it sort of denies the reality of time passing and the fact that things decay and die and change. And when you're trying to resurrect something which is dead in this way, it's and not making something new out of it, you're just trying to bring it back to the way it was before. It is this sort of infatuation with death. It's death worship, really. Is what it is. And so, so I think that, the EU definitely did this to a certain extent.
And we get that a lot with how the characters, although they have almost adult children, don't age.
Yeah.
They're still as spry as they were when they were 20 years old, or, Han was 30 years old.
Yeah, their personalities haven't changed, really.
They haven't aged from that original trilogy sort of frame that they were in, but now they have adult children and they deal with those like near adult children, those young adult children, in the way that their original trilogy selves might do it, rather than having the wisdom of age and experience to handle those. And so of course we have the death of Ben Solo, version 1.
Yeah, Jason Solo.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I know what you meant. I knew what you meant. Jason Solo.
I mean, he's died twice now and been saved once in Willow.
The point is we have killed off Han and Leia's children several times, and we have saved him once in Willow. Bring back Willow. Anyway.
Yeah,
but yes.
Exactly. This message brought to you by following Willow.
Yes, exactly.
But so the EU was this, although unintentional, homeland restoration.
Yes.
They were trying to tell new stories, but then they ended up leaning into this idea that you don't grow old, you don't age.
The characters didn't have to age because that wasn't the purpose of the story. The purpose of the story was to let you keep reliving that feeling you had with the original trilogy forever. And this is where, in my opinion, this is the origin of the myth of badass Luke.
Yep.
I think this is where badass Luke comes from, because I'm sorry, go watch the original trilogy again. Luke is not a badass. He's not. He's a whiny baby in the first movie.
Slightly a whiny baby in the second one.
A little bit of a whiny baby in the second one, yeah.
Yeah, but he's very mature by the third movie. But
he's still mature, but he's not a badass. That's the thing. He's mature because he chooses not to be a badass.
Yes, exactly. And I also think that the EU in general was a split in the fandom. And so when we talk about whose homeland you're recovering, when we get to future storytelling, there's already a split. And I, go and listen to my episode with Maggie Nowakowski on fanzines and the early fandom, and how many of the fanzine writers who were primarily women really were interested in writing the future stories or the EU, and the publishing arm of Lucasfilm and the storytellers, the editors at the time, went with primarily male authors.
Yeah, they shut them out.
They shut out these fandom writers who were
Mhm.
interested in continuing the story and paid attention to everything.
Mhm.
And so that created like the first major, I would argue, fandom division. Instead of incorporating the fanon
Yep.
into the story, it said no, it has to be of this type of fan. This type
Yes.
of fan is the homeland.
Yep. And I know
Official
a lot
canon
of
homeland.
And I know a lot of people love the EU, and I know a lot of women love the EU, and I get it. So I'm not judging that. But it is true that it definitely was, they shut out femme writers, and that has a certain result. I remember trying to get into the EU, and I really struggled because the best way to put it is I could just tell these stories were not written for me because it was not
Mhm.
what I was interested in, and it was not what I wanted to see with the characters. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad, but again, the point is it ends up being exclusionary because it creates that imagined homeland for one group of people and not for everyone.
I would say the other way that fans sort of explored the Star Wars universe was in role-playing games. So like
Yeah.
the D6 West End Games version, the D20 version later in the 90s, and then eventually Fantasy Flight. And that was inclusionary because you could build a character that was also a Jedi or was force sensitive, and you could like have your own adventures and go off on your own path. There was also the sort of hard and fast rule of creating the toys and the
Mhm.
things you could actually purchase and have
Mhm.
at home to recreate the stories in your own mind. And they could only be the versions of the things that were actually sold.
Mhm. Yeah.
So there is sort of like a locking in place of what was important at the time,
Mhm.
which is fine, but it does sort of create a specific, very narrow lens to what was reality.
Well, it contributed to the gatekeeping. Like
Yeah.
a lot of us talk about how, like we were very gatekept as femme Star Wars fans. And, you get a lot of boys and men telling you, you're not a real Star Wars fan, or quizzing you and trying to determine your bona fides and everything. Like, what are your fan credentials? And you get that a lot. And a lot of that was created because of the marketing, and the marketing was trying to trade on nostalgia for boys and young men.
Mhm.
And so because it ignored the female fans, it gave the impression that there were no female fans,
Yeah,
which
which
of
is
course
just
was
not the
not
truth.
true.
Yeah.
Right. And and what's sad about that is that I think continued all the way up into the modern era and created a lot of the issues that we saw with the sequel trilogy.
Yep. I would say that the prequels themselves, in how they blew up this textual version of nostalgia that fans
Yes.
had,
Mhm.
uh, also challenged a lot of fans.
It did. It absolutely did. Well,
And
because
there was like this allergic reaction to the story that
just like
played out.
badass Luke wasn't real. Like the idea of saying, like, well, yeah, arguably Vader was a badass, but that's not the point of his story. Now we're going to show you him as a little kid,
Yeah.
right?
And that allergic reaction to, oh, he's always been evil, or he always had this darkness, but he was actually quite an innocent child in the first movie, and people had like this, like the cognitive dissonance that they couldn't get over for it.
Yeah, they were horrified. People were super, super upset at seeing Anakin Skywalker as a child. They did not like that.
And
Like,
also like
yeah.
how he played out in Attack of the Clones as
Mm-hmm.
kind of whiny,
Yeah.
really lustful, like a
Yeah.
teenage boy.
Yep.
And like all of the struggles that, and I still think Hayden did amazing.
I
And
love Hayden
yeah.
Christensen. I truly do. I think he did amazing. He was perfect, and I love it. And like I have
And
my
it has
feelings
to be that
about
way. It has to be
yeah.
awkward. It has to be gross and
It
weird.
does. It does. And I mean, listen, again, like if any one of us could have done it, would we have done some things differently? Sure. But you know what? This is George's story, at least at that point in time. And he told it the way he wanted to tell it. And for what it is, it's very clear what he intended. And the performances, I think, are what needed to happen. And so I understand why people struggled with it, but it went away from just, I don't like the way this is executed, to like, this is a personal affront to me.
Yeah, like you have destroyed a part of me. You've attacked me on a personal level. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's where you get that, like that documentary, like The People versus George Lucas, which is like, I don't really recommend it because it's really mean spirited. But I mean, think about it. Even the title, The People versus George Lucas, like as if
Who are these people?
as if they're trying him in a court of law for making a movie. Like what?
Yeah.
It's wild. And so, yeah, it's that belief in the shared homeland and the idea that you owned it. Okay, and this is where another thing I want to get into actually is that this is one of the other dangers of nostalgia is that when you create that shared homeland and that myth, it leads to a feeling of ownership. And a feeling of ownership can make you feel like anyone who's trying to share that, let's say, land
or change it. Or change it. Yeah.
Or just whatever. Anyone who happens to also live in that space has no right to be there.
Yeah.
And I think that we've very clearly seen the damage that can do. And so it's a big problem that like people, they took it personally and then they felt that they had a right to basically kick people out of fandom or disavow a creator or whatever.
Or just attack other people who are just genuinely like interested in their little space or their ideals. And so this happened a lot on like bulletin boards during the prequel era. After that, because we're now all connected on the internet, we can't avoid people's opinions anymore. And this happened like during fanzine time too. I don't want to say that didn't happen during that period of time. Nostalgia or my version of the story or my homeland associated with the story being different than others can actually cause these feelings of, again, defense. You're trying to defend your own homeland from others, what your version of the truth is.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
that's where it becomes personal and can cause some people to do quite very negative things.
Right. And like, I'm going to say that like we see it even, within the Reylo fandom. While on the one hand, I feel like Reylos have been the target more often than not, there have also been moments where people in defense of Reylo have like done some really terrible things that they shouldn't have done. So, I think it's important to understand that anyone can do this. And it's because, we just have that deep of an emotional connection to these things. And so having an awareness that we do not own it and it is never a justification for attacking others is really important.
Are we ready to talk about the sequel trilogies?
Oh God. Yep, let's do it. We're going to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, like there was the shows, right? Like, so we had Clone Wars and then we had Rebels, which kind of built new in amongst the old, right? So sometimes they tied to the original trilogies. Sometimes they like explained the prequels better. Same with Rebels, right? It tied into the original trilogy. It was like this connective tissue between them.
But I do think that Clone Wars actually became its own sort of shared homeland then, because so I'll be honest, I still haven't finished Clone Wars. It's just, I'm really struggling with it. It's not speaking to me in the way that other Star Wars things do. I'm going to get through it eventually, but it's just taking me a really long time. But a lot of people love it. And for many people, it's actually their Star Wars. It's what they grew up with. It is literally
now
when they
Rebels.
think
Rebels too happens.
Right.
Yeah.
When they think Star Wars, they think Clone Wars and Rebels and basically just the Filoni animated shows. That's what they think of. That is what they associate Star Wars with. And so they have that deep, connection to it, the childhood memory of like, this is my Star Wars. And so what I find so interesting is that their perspective of Star Wars, what it is, what it should be, who the characters are, is completely different from mine. Because it is based on what they saw in Clone Wars. So their concept of Anakin, Obi-Wan, Padme, Ahsoka, all these characters is completely different from my perspective of the exact same characters. We don't see them the same way. And And so they're very attached to them and they're very defensive of those versions of the characters.
Yep.
And so it's interesting how, even though that's more recent, that's already something that people, have taken as that this is my Star Wars, this is my homeland.
And you think about it, and maybe they picked it up when they were between 9 and 12, which is the Star Wars age.
Yep.
And now they're, a full adults, and that's what they're speaking to.
Yep, exactly.
And maybe they got into the sequel trilogy later and they, jived with that, or they got into the prequels because of it. But their lens of what Anakin and Padme and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka are is entirely based on the Clone Wars.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very different.
And that's the thing about Star Wars is your Star Wars will be different depending on when you built your homeland.
I agree. Like whatever it was that first caught you when it comes to Star Wars, like what, not even the first thing you saw, but just the first thing that you responded emotionally to. I think that becomes your sort of Star Wars homeland and the thing that you're truly defensive of. And then things that are aligned with that are things that you sort of accept and go, yes, okay, this is Star Wars to me. And things that aren't aligned with that, you're like, I reject this. This is not Star Wars. And, I'm
maybe your Star Wars homeland is like really big. Yeah. And you're one of those fans that kind of likes everything.
Loves everything.
Which is okay too.
That's cool too. Good for you. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's cool. And that's what's so important about this is that attempts to define Star Wars will always defy attempts to define it.
Yeah.
Like it just will. I mean, we love doing it, but ultimately we have to look at things through lenses because there are an unlimited number of ways to view Star Wars.
And that's why, I had that warning at the start of it. Like, this is just one way we're looking at it today, but it doesn't mean it's the be all and end all because it is so complex. It is so vast that the conversation really never ends.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure we had spoken to that because I think it's important that the textually and also subtextually and how fans reacted to it is very important. The Clone Wars and the Rebels period of the kind of animated middle ground.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Then we have the sequel trilogy, which it's so funny because my eldest had a good friend who told me when I was super excited about the Force Awakens, it had just come out. He was hanging out in our house and his mom picked him up and I was like, hey, are you excited about the Force Awakens? He's like, I don't understand why they had to recreate the original New Hope.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, is he wrong?
I mean, it was done purposefully.
It was. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not.
There was definitely a desire to pull original fans, maybe not prequel fans, original trilogy fans, back into the fold and say, look, it's a story you're going to be familiar with, but a new generation. And that was even the wording in the trailers.
It was. Yeah. No, it was. It's all the marketing, everything. It's interesting how, there is sincerity to the story, but also a lot of it was just very carefully crafted to trade on nostalgia. It was deliberate. Again, if you were in the theater for Force Awakens, I want you to remember the scream when people saw the Millennium Falcon for the first time. I want you to remember that.
To little moments when Finn picks up the training droid from the Millennium Falcon, commons area and is like, huh, and chucks it over his shoulder. Those moments. Yeah. When Han walks through the door with Chewie and is like, Chewie, we're home.
We're home. Actually, that's fun. That's a textual example of nostalgia right there. We're home. He walked into the Millennium Falcon and recognized it as his home.
Yeah. He hasn't lived there in 20 some years.
Yeah.
He hasn't had it. He's been living, on Hosnian Prime. He was doing racing. We all find that out later, but he hasn't been home in that long.
Yeah.
But that was absolutely him breaking the fourth wall and speaking to 100% the original trilogy fans.
Which is why it was in the trailer. Again, because it was they were trying to signal this to the fans. And it worked, I went to see it. I enjoyed it. Absolutely.
TFA did well. And it introduced enough of these new characters that hooked you, me, femme storyteller lovers who
Yeah.
were excited about this like potential of this like new generation and these characters that they were like not quite what we were expecting.
Yeah, but that's the thing.
But
right? Yeah. But
people thought that this was being value signaled as a retell of the EU.
It's a combination of things. I think it's being value signal is a retelling of the EU, but I also think it was probably really difficult to determine where the line should be between
when they said the EU doesn't exist.
but not even just that, but like between trading on nostalgia from the original trilogy and introducing new characters, concepts, blah, 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 blah. And I think what is
Mark
possible,
Hamill, Carrie Fisher,
right,
Harrison Ford are not the people that they were so long ago.
And part of what I think kind of signaled that, but clearly not strong enough for some people, I think was the death of Han Solo. Because the death of Han Solo should have been, and I think was intended to be, the signal that like, hey, these characters, their story is over.
Yeah.
We're telling the story of the new generation now. Like that arguably
the death of the mentor is so classic.
It's so critical.
It's so important. Classic. It is mythic as hell. It is, yes, you might have gotten the story of the old hero once upon a time when he was in his youth, but he dies for the sake of the new hero.
But that's also something that people struggled with because again, they took it so personally that this character had been killed off. That they
rejected it all out.
Yeah. Well, they rejected outright. And not only that, they rejected Ben Solo as a potential redemptive hero, as a hero who could attain. A lot of them at that point decided that he was beyond redemption, that it was not possible him. They didn't want to see him redeemed. They wanted him to die. They wanted revenge against him rather than understanding him as like, this child, like as like the child of our heroes, and we want to see him come back to the fold and everything. They didn't want that because they were so, like that attachment to the childhood beloved character of Han Solo was so strong that they rejected the new character outright.
Yeah. And he had to die. That's really important too, because it was like a way of like restoring, in a way, like revenge justice.
Right.
To restore what was right. He at least, the person who murdered Han Solo is dead. So that's what they wanted from the story.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And I still think the sequel trilogy, like at that point, had those fans because they wanted that revenge.
Right.
Like,
I think they could have taken those fans. They could have taken those fans on that journey and gotten them there. Yeah. But there were a number of factors at play. I think that the problem then you ran into was, again, I don't think anyone anticipated the extent to which this vision, this shared memory of what Star Wars was, which wasn't actually reflective of reality and or was trapped in one period of time without any possibility of change or evolution or whatever.
And so let's talk about Badass Luke and how that was the vision of Luke that they had in their minds when he showed up at the end of TFA. And so when we got what we got in TLJ, it was so dissonant from their idea of Luke. And there was no steps in between to show how he had gotten there, how he had given up, how he had been depressed. And unless you had a fair amount of introspection and lived in experience, because I do hear from a lot of men who rewatched The Last Jedi after like they had kind of taken a step back and like looked at it through their own lens of their life and said, oh my God, Luke is me.
Right.
That get it now. But like at the time, because of what they'd either expected from the end of The Last Jedi, or they couldn't see Last Jedi Luke being TLJ Luke, and they couldn't see EU Luke being TLJ Luke.
Right. Exactly. So it was just this problem of like, that wasn't the Luke that these people believed in. And so when they were confronted with him, they absolutely hated it.
Yeah.
And so there was a strong backlash, among other things. There was a strong backlash to that version of Luke. And it was all based in nostalgia completely. And again, we go back to this idea of nostalgia being this like, this romance with the past and this vision that we had of, the potential and how things could have been. And I think having that vision closed off by the on-screen version of TLJ Luke.
Yeah.
It's just really, again, it made people feel like their homeland had been ripped away.
I keep on thinking about that poster of that fan had created with the casting announcements, and like Daisy Ridley is like a princess, and like Adam Driver's like a Boba Fett type bounty hunter, and like that is their sequel trilogy homeland.
Right. And it had how it always has the big floating heads, right? It had the original trilogy trio of Luke, Han, and Leia as like the biggest, most prominent characters in that. And this is where I go back into like nostalgia refuses to admit that aging and decay happens. Like when they appear in the sequel trilogy, they are old. They are not in a position to go doing adventures and whatever else. Like they've aged, they've had life experience, their bodies are not what they once were, they have gray hair, they have wrinkles. People do not stay the picture of what they were when they were the young, like, heroes of their 20s and 30s. Like
Harrison Ford broke his foot.
Yes.
Filming.
Yeah.
He himself broke his foot. The archetypically in a story, these characters would have been kings, crones, mages.
Yeah.
They're out of the adventures and running around.
Right. So it's not reasonable to expect them to be the heroes of this story 30 years later, but that is what people expected because that is what they remember as Star Wars.
Yeah.
It's wild. Yeah. So
it's hard to explain to somebody who is sort of trapped in their version of the homeland.
Yes.
Like this.
Yeah.
Their homeland is not the same as yours.
Yeah. Well, and not even just that it isn't the same, but that their homeland, like, you can't go back.
You can't go back, yeah.
It's like, it's gone. It only lives in your memory. That's the only place it lives anymore. It's not, we can't recreate it. And that's why the whole, like, and we'll get into this later as well, but the whole, like, deep fake thing, it doesn't work for a lot of people because of the fact that it is trying to recreate this past that you can't because those actors are not that young anymore.
And so, we've talked about how the reaction to TLJ, I would say that TFA and TLJ brought in more new Star Wars fans than many of the properties.
Definitely.
Since and before that. Like,
yep.
New fans, women, people of color, fans that Star Wars hadn't been able to get at previously.
Right.
Because it like brought them into the fold and saying, new story, new generation, you can be part of Star Wars too. You're seen in Star Wars. You're part of Star Wars.
This is your homeland too.
Yeah, you can come along for the adventure. You can be And so like that was really important from a like straight up commercial property perspective to say you're accepted, especially women. Like, women are the ones that schedule trips to Disneyland, things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're the ones that are spending all the money on merch when it comes to t-shirts and other things like that and buying toothpaste.
Yeah.
But not necessarily the toys, right?
Yeah. The toys are never Target. Well, not never, but rarely. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole other thing.
So, we have this story. It pulled in a lot of fans. It had this like wildly dissonant reaction. TLJ is the reason this podcast exists.
Yep.
Because I couldn't find a podcast that wanted to talk about Star Wars in the way that was my homeland.
Right.
Welcome to my homeland. This is a podcast. But you get what I'm saying? All I heard was this hate. Endless vitriol about it. But it was because the people that had existing platforms were quite literally the loudest.
Yeah.
And I can't not imagine that there are people at Lucasfilm to this day that feel that there was overwhelming hate to TLJ.
Yeah. It's really weird because this goes back to how like those memories, false memories can be created.
Doesn't everybody hate TLJ?
I know.
Somebody asked me once, and I said no.
And it was still wildly successful by every metric. Again, go reread the Rewriting Ripley, articles and everything. But like, it was wildly successful by so many metrics. And it did, to your point, brought so many new fans in, and it energized fans. And, it was a massive smashing success. It really, truly was. Like, that is the historical reality. But because there was this very, very loud backlash from a group of people who, again, felt personally affronted by this because it didn't reflect their vision of Star Wars, it gave the impression that it was not a beloved film. And that is what ultimately resulted in The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, which is like a weird mix. And I'm still thinking about how much like mythic important motifs are actually in The Rise of Skywalker and how much it still ties to some of those things, but yet resurrects the EU entirely, resurrects the original trilogy, tries to resurrect the prequels, but doesn't like them.
It doesn't care for them at all. It's here's what I always say about the sequel trilogy culminating in TROS. Remember what I said earlier about how one of the ways that groups would try to capitalize on nostalgia, or maybe sometimes even treat nostalgia when it was believed to be a disease, was creating fake ruins. Ruins. In the sequel trilogy, everything is a ruin. All right? The characters are ruins because they're all old and like, they're aging and they're, they just have the marks of age. They're not the vital, youthful characters they once were. The New Republic barely lasted what? Like
half a movie?
Yeah. Like, but like, I mean, in total, I think something around
30
like 25, years. 30 years, not quite 30 years, right around 30 years. So like, that's it. It lasted all that. And then it was destroyed. All of the sets, it starts off with Rey in, this carcass
the desert
of a downed Star Destroyer, right? And so she's there and she's taking these things from the ruins of this big battle and from the ships, and it's all, OT era battle, right? That was the final battle of the Galactic Civil War. And so she's got that. And then when she gets the Millennium Falcon is at that point ultimately a ruin. It is old, it is falling apart. It was a hunk of junk before, and it's even more of a hunk of junk now. She even calls it garbage. And then what else? They get to Maz's. Maz lives in a castle. It gets destroyed by the end of that sequence. They ultimately, Hosnian Prime gets blown up. Starkiller Base gets blown up. And then we're all back.
The planet that Leia's hanging out in gets blown up.
And it's an old, where the Resistance is, it's an old Alliance base.
Yeah.
It's literally like
they're like
reusing.
They're like reusing all of these aspects of the past. Yeah.
Oh yeah, the shot where Rey puts on the helmet, the pilot helmet at the beginning, and it's supposed to be all like cute and endearing. That's quite macabre. That she had to have taken that off of a dead pilot, a corpse. Like that's not cute. That's kind of messed up, really. And she's living inside of a downed, AT-AT.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, I could go on. So that's
TFA.
TFA. And then there's also, I won't go into everything, but there's like everything in TLJ is also ruins. You got the ruins of the Jedi
Acto,
Temple.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. All stuff. There is a slight difference in how it's presented in TLJ because anytime there is destruction, it is framed as part of a cycle in which renewal will actually follow the destruction. Yeah. Like, for example, yes, the base is destroyed on Crate, but there's salt, which cleanses a wound, which is going to cause healing. So, there's the framing is different. But then you get in to TROS, and it's ratcheted up to like 11 because
Death Star ruins.
Yeah,
they're in an old base that's on when they start out, an old rebel base.
The ships, all the ships are like old ships.
Yeah.
How come there's no new ships? How come all the ships are old ships? Like, I just had no one's built anything new in 30 years. Like, really? Like, it's everything is old and there's no idea of what we're going to do in the future. The only interest is just in, well, we're going to defeat the bad guys who are basically identical to the old bad guys. In the case of Palpatine, quite literally, it's the same bad guy.
It's the same
we're
bad
not
guy,
even changing it. Like, it's so everything is ruins. Everything is, we're going to try to resurrect this. And I love, or I don't love rather, but it shocks me that they did this and didn't understand the implications of it. But like, when you see the Star Destroyer crashing into the desert right behind the other Star Destroyer that crashed into the desert 30
like
years
the same,
before.
Yeah. We're in this cycle of destruction that we cannot escape. The endless Star War. Okay,
Star Wars.
Unintentionally we get your point, but like for us, the nostalgia of the fact that it felt like there was a significant change in Return of the Jedi, that he chose to make a different choice and thus it changed things for us in some ways has been taken away.
Yeah, well,
and for others too.
Well, but the nostalgia, what we're saying here is what nostalgia is being served in TROS. What's being served in TROS is the idea of a death cult. It's endless war. It's endless destruction and death. And look how it's the exact same destruction and death we saw last time. And it's never going to end. And then, of course, where does the story end? In a ruin. Tatooine. It's a literal graveyard. People are buried there.
Yeah.
Like, and then she buries people.
More things.
She buries it's just it's so messed up that like this whole story.
It's supposed to be hopeful.
Yeah, it's like this whole story just becomes this orgy of death and everything is old if you
read authors who talk about sort of right-wing propaganda, fascism propaganda, and inevitably the cult of death is part of it, right? Is the idea that like you're obsessed with death and that you should die for this cause. And that's where it always leads.
Yep.
And so like when we're quite critical about the story from this lens, it's because we're like, where's the creation?
Yeah. Where's the life?
Where's the renewal, which we got in The Last Jedi from a storytelling perspective. But the values of the nostalgic properties are not leaning that way. It's trapping you in this idea of the past.
Exactly.
Not that I don't think that there isn't good things in The Rise of Skywalker. Certainly, I love some of the symbolism to do with healing and things like that, but it's all sort of caught up in this zombification of what Star Wars is.
And it's that endpoint. It's that endpoint that we're in a graveyard in a desert alone with ghosts. In a ruin, blah, 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 blah. And she does the little sliding thing, which represents, like a regression back to childhood, which is, again, the whole point of nostalgia is you're regressing back to that childhood state. Yeah. You're not growing. You're not becoming an adult. You're not maturing. And so I think that's ultimately what it is like, even though there are definitely good things to be drawn from TROS, this end point communicates that it was a nostalgic exercise all along and that the end point of it is
the beginning of the
death.
is death. Yeah. Yeah. And that it didn't really matter.
Right. And none of it really mattered. Yeah. We told this whole story just to end up right where we were. And I'm like, well, what was the point of all of that?
Yeah. So all right. Let's talk about Mando, because I think that's the Mandalorian, which I loved the first season of. I thought it was fresh. I thought it used the interstitial Easter eggs, like using an IG unit, but in a different character, in a different relationship, in a very solid way. And it had this idea of sort of the Holy Grail, the divine child of our Grogu character, as a way to sort of talk about the past, but also talk about the future and how it showed time.
Well, it was interesting because it traded on nostalgia in its imagery, in the
Mandalorian being like Boba Fett.
Right, in the promos and in that first episode and everything. But what's so fascinating is the introduction of Grogu actually undermined all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that's what's frustrating to me about the show is that it did have so much potential. It seemed to have some awareness about, how nostalgia, can be used in Star Wars, how fans might react to different things. And so I feel like that potential was there. And I think that potentially what it became is similar to how Tross was a reaction to some of the backlash to TLJ. I feel like Mando was kind of the opposite. It was a reaction to people actually loved it. They reacted very positively to it. And so they were like, great, let's just give them more nostalgia. And then they leaned really hard into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, oh my goodness, when you watch the season 2 making of Mandalorian and you hear Dave and John talk about bringing Luke Skywalker back, it's like they can't even help themselves. They want to restore their childhood.
Yep.
He is quite literally in the same outfit that he was wearing when he was in The Return of the Jedi. He is a badass version that he was in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the same lightsaber moves as Anakin Skywalker, proving he's no less.
Mm-hmm.
Like he is this imagined version of what Luke Skywalker is.
Right. And
it's kind of creepy to me, in truth.
Yeah.
And maybe that's how people reacted to Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't see it. They can't see it. I can't see it. That was not my homeland.
Yeah, it's not recognizable to me. Like I respect the fact that a lot of people love that. For example, my husband just loved it so much. He was so happy to see that. It just brought him so much joy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it at all because to me, I'm like, that's not Luke. That's not how Luke would behave. That's not where he was at the end of Return of the Jedi.
He knows droids have feelings.
Yeah. But I mean, like, just in general, he doesn't prove that love saves and that violence isn't the answer at the end of, and I know I'm oversimplifying, but he doesn't do that at the end of Return of the Jedi just to turn around and just like mow down an entire, and people always want to be like, oh, well, they're droids. It's not real. But like, it's still saying violence is the answer. And this is where we go back to like, the American monomyth that I know that you and Ty have talked about quite a lot. I've only just started kind of getting into it, but it's this idea that violence is always the answer and solves all problems. And what the book points out, I think quite insightfully is that even Anakin as a child, when he accidentally goes in and blows up the control ship, for the droid army, like he doesn't arguably kill anyone because it's all manned by droids, but he still like basically accidentally has a violent solution to the problem. And so it's really kind of the same thing with Luke Skywalker in Mandalorian season 2 is like, yeah, they might be droids, but he comes in and he uses violence to win.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems very out of character to me. And it seems, again, to be leaning into this vision of Star Wars that I don't share.
Yeah. And I think that it's important to admit that to ourselves. Like, I don't share that vision of Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
I can totally see why some people would like it.
I get it. I mean, like, listen, if you're able to admit that Luke Skywalker was not a badass in the original trilogy, but he actually was in the EU, then maybe you're just really excited to finally see that version of him on screen. I think that's how a lot of people reacted. And that's totally fine. Like, I don't get it, and it's not my thing. But like, I understand that it really, a lot of people, it gave them something that they had always imagined, but never really had.
And like, to that point, we get like our future storytelling in, the Acolyte that's upcoming. There was a clip that was just released when we're recording this that showed her using her light whip.
Mm-hmm.
Which online, some people are already like, what is that? That's too extreme. Like, their version of their homeland is not like that.
Yeah.
And maybe they were really into the EU. The light whip is from the EU. So it's like, what version of your homeland are you protecting? Are you protecting the one that women aren't Jedi? Are you protecting one where the EU exists? Oh, but only parts of the EU.
Right.
Again, we talk about this, that your version of what you think is reality is not.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so hopefully people can become more accepting and just, just, I don't know, just understand that people's version of reality will not be yours.
Star Wars canon has grown so much and has become so flexible and, so different depending on who's telling the story, that there are now potentially a number of different sort of Star Wars homelands that people may ascribe to or remember. And so, I think this is important to remember. And I think the ability to say, I love this, I respond to this, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
Is being able to do that is important. It's important. Well, I think that you have to do it if you want to remain a Star Wars fan, because otherwise we're just going to be at each other's throats all the time. And like, why?
Yeah. And like, there's really just no point in getting upset that, oh my gosh, Young Jedi created, it's for little kids. There's no point in getting upset about that. Oh no, not everything is built for you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's critical, is it's understanding that like you don't own it. It's not yours, like your memories are yours, but that's all they are. And half the time those aren't even accurate. So, it's understanding that and, taking what you can from these stories that help you in your life. And, when that is something that you share with other people, you can use that to create social bonds. And that's a good thing. And so, yes, enjoy Star Wars with other like-minded fans. You absolutely should. That's wonderful.
And that is the benefit of the internet, is that you can find your particular fandom in Star Wars very, very easily. But don't defend it like it's your homeland, because that's just, everybody's homeland is going to be incredibly different than another person's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
I just really liked this conversation. I hope people enjoy listening to it, because I thought this was really fun to discuss. It's just a very different lens to discuss Star Wars through, and it's very cool. So yeah, thank you so much for talking about this.
Yeah, no, I love it because it also is in some ways a way to speak about Star Wars with realism, in that we get caught in what our version is. And it's important to acknowledge that your version is not going to be somebody else's.
Yep.
All right, everybody. Thank you, Missy, for joining us. Where can people find you if they're looking for more of your stuff online?
Okay. Well, mostly I am active on Tumblr these days, where I am all girls are princesses. Fair warning, I'm in my Bridgerton era right now, so that's what's happening over there. But I'm sure I will get back to Star Wars soon.
Yes, you will. That is a promise and a threat.
It is both. It is both of those things. Absolutely.
I, of course, am Marie Claire Gould. I am still on Twitter. I apologize. But I am also in my Bridgerton era. So
yes, that's my homeland right now. That's where I live.
All right. Take care, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie Claire Gould, your host. Our music is orchestral music by Christy Crew for What the Force. You can support the show directly on Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We'd like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love and are obsessed with What the Force: Sarah Joy, John, In Wild Space, Hal Rude, Anna Perez, Neil, Christian Luca, Carly Ann, Scott C., and Susan. You can support the show by wearing the Force at our merch store, or like and subscribe on YouTube, or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or any other pod apps. It helps people find the show. You can connect to us on Twitter, on Facebook, or at whattheforce.ca, or our Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.